a little more time this week in talking about the two styles of academic argument. And although you already know the basic understanding or definition of each of these two styles, what we need to know are what components make up each style. So let's jump into the two paths to academic argument. Well, you can't see because my own picture is obscuring it, but we are going to be talking about the traditional style of academic argument first. And as you're seeing with things popping up, I will not lose. Losing is not an option. There is ground. That should give you enough information to know that we're talking about traditional academic argument. There's a philosopher who is the person who first really defined this style of traditional academic argument, and his last name is Toulmin. So to say that the Toulmin approach, when we say that, we really mean the traditional approach. They really are synonymous, and you will hear me using those terms interchangeably. I'll use the Toulmin approach and I will use the traditional approach. Now, what Toulmin did was he went back and he researched years and years of court cases, especially in England. And what he was trying to find were what would be the common elements in each successful court case. And he ended up coming up with a pattern, basically, that showed that every time someone had had a successful court case in the English courts, it followed with the same parts. Now, if you take a philosophy class, they're going to get into this and it's going to be very deep and they're going to use a lot of fancy words. What we are going to do in this class is to present a simplified version of the Toulmin or traditional type of academic argument. We already know in this style, the main idea is that one of us is going to win, and we know that when one of us wins, that means that one of us is going to lose. There's no middle ground here. There is no consensus. There is no giving way till we come up with a new solution. It's simply that both parties go in knowing that one will win and one will not win. So there it is, the Toulmin approach, which is also known as traditional argument. We've already discussed in an earlier lesson that this is popular in English classes. This is also very popular in the court system. This is popular in speech classes. This is very popular in advertising. Now, some textbooks will tell you that there are 6 parts. And I am going to be very honest with you and tell you that those 6 parts are so similar that they overlap with each other. And for years, I have tried to come up with a clearer way of teaching this traditional argument. And so this semester, I am going to try to teach it as a 5-part argument. So there are 5 components or parts to traditional academic argument, which is also known as Toulmin. So let's go ahead and explore those 5 parts. The first part, part 1, and by the way, in order to do your big project for this class, you are going to have to understand these, also for a quiz too. So you need to understand these parts. Okay? Ready? Part 1 is the claim. This is the thesis. Now you know that a thesis statement in the essay, any essay, is the main idea. It's the main idea typically in one sentence that any reader could find that sentence and read it and know what the rest of the essay is going to be about. It's the same way in traditional argument. Anybody can read this claim or the thesis statement and know exactly what the rest of the argument is going to be about. The claim is what you are asking someone to do, or you are asking them or telling them what action they need to take, or you are telling them what belief they need to accept. It's very simple. Part 2. These are the reasons, and we can really think of this as saying because. So if you think back to let me see if I can get this pen here. If you think back to part 1, which is the claim, here's what I want you to do, then you follow it up with because. Wouldn't that make sense? If I am asking you to adopt a new belief or a new behavior, I should be able to automatically back that up with the reasons why. So part 1, here's what I want you to do. Part 2, because. And in an even simpler way of putting it, that's our proof. Why do I need to do part 1? Part 3 then is the evidence. So I've said I want you to do something. I've told you why I think you should do it. If you are like most people, you're not just automatically going to accept a new belief because someone says you should do it. We need proof. We need evidence. And this is part 3. What evidence supports each reason? So for every reason that you offer someone why they need to do something, it has to be backed up with this evidence. And when we talk about evidence, we talk about definitions, we talk about statistics, we talk about research, we talk about firsthand accounts. And this is going to make a little more sense, I think, on the next slide. Part 4 in the Toulmin or traditional argument is rebuttals. This is now, you've made your claim. You have laid it out. Here's what I want you to do. Here's why you need to do it, and here's proof that I'm right. But you can't stop there, because if you stop there, you're just preaching. So we go into part 4, and part 4 is where you are really anticipating and getting into the other side's thinking in their head. And you are anticipating what their objections are going to be. Well, I can't do that because. And if you can think that way and anticipate what their objections will be, then you can automatically refute them before they even respond. The worst thing you can do in traditional argument is say, here's what I need you to do, here's why I need you to do it, here's the evidence, now do it, without ever acknowledging that they might not want to, that they might need more proof. So you have to acknowledge the other side's objections. It doesn't make your argument weaker to acknowledge that they might actually have some pretty good objections. And for every objection that the other side would offer, you really have 3 options. You can agree with them. You can say that is a really good, valid point. However, I still think that the evidence that I have shown in part B is very compelling evidence. You can refute it. You can say, here is my full-blown argument. Here's evidence 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This is where your point is completely wrong or weak. Or you can concede each point or that point. And when we say concede, sometimes in an argument, you want somebody to do something, you tell them why, you give them the evidence, and then they have an objection that is so good that you can't refute it. And sometimes, if you have enough evidence, it's okay on one point to say, you know what, you are absolutely right. I agree with you 100%. And what that is going to do is open the way for part 5. Part 5 is something called the qualifiers. This is where you go back to part 1 and you narrow your argument down a little bit. So in other words, this is where you'd say, here's what I want you to do, and here's why I want you to do it, and here's the evidence. However, maybe my argument was too big to start, so we're going to narrow it down a little bit. So you can actually see that if somebody brings up a terrific rebuttal that's so strong that you can't refute it, that's so strong that you actually say you are absolutely right about that one particular point, that would just automatically lead the way for you to narrow it down. I think, in other words, this example here, under what circumstances are my claims true? How certain am I that this is really true? And this is where these 3 words really soften an argument. probably, could, often. Do you see how those words are not dogmatic? Dogmatic means where you are saying there's only one way, there are no other options. But when you soften the argument with these qualifiers, probably, could, often, now you're saying, I'm not saying that my argument is 100% right in every case. And that goes a long way to winning. So let's take a look. Your claim is, here's what you want people to do. The legal drinking age should remain 21. Why? Because teenagers are not mature enough to drink. Now you've got to prove it. You have got to offer statistics or other research that proves that teenagers tend to get in more trouble, maybe with accidents, maybe with other inappropriate behaviors after they drink. So here's what I want you to accept, here's why, and now I'm going to prove it. Now that I've laid out my argument in this traditional type of argument, now I'm going to be thinking ahead. I'm going to get into the other side's thinking, and I'm going to be thinking, what are they going to say? Where are they going to be raising their hand and saying, hey, wait? And that's your rebuttals. So you might have someone from the other side who would say, well, you know, some teens are more mature than some adults. Some teens are going to drink and they're not going to get in trouble with the law. They're not going to drive afterward. They're not going to make stupid decisions. So how do I respond? I can agree, but still say the bulk of my evidence still makes me stick to my claim. I can completely refute it and say, well, actually, I have all of these facts and figures which will show you that teenagers, don't make good decisions after they drink. Or you can concede the point. You may say, you are absolutely right. There are a lot of responsible teenagers out there. We certainly know more responsible than people over 21 who are drinking. So you are conceding that point. And that's where you have to go backtrack a little bit, and now you have to narrow that argument down. You think about, what about teenagers in other countries who are drinking before the age of 21 and they have lower instances of trouble? And so you can change your claim. Go back to the beginning. Instead of saying the legal drinking age should remain 21, what if we say the legal drinking age should remain 21 in most countries, or the legal drinking age should remain 21 in the United States? So do you see how we started with a broad claim? Here's why I think we ought to do it. Here's the evidence. But now that I'm listening to what the other side is saying a little bit, I'm still going to rethink my argument. I'm going to narrow it down. This is not compromising. This is not looking for common ground. This is still going for the win. You still want this legal drinking age to remain at 21, but you are a smart enough academic arguer to understand that you just need to narrow that down a little bit. So that is traditional Toulmin academic argument, 5 components. Now the other side is the side that we call consensual argument, which means that both sides are actively engaged, they're actively working together. But the guy who started this, his name was Carl Rogers. He's the one who put it together. And so we tend to call the traditional or consensual, I'm sorry, not traditional, the consensual argument Rogerian. There he is, Carl Rogers. If you take, especially an educational psychology class, I was going to say a psychology class, but especially educational psychology, you are going to trip across the name Carl Rogers. He's a pretty serious person in that field. So what he wants to do in this argument is reduce conflict and to establish common ground. So what does it look like? We're actually both partially right. Do you see how that's very different from Toulmin's? One of us is going to be right and one of us is going to be wrong. But the Rogerian argument comes out and says we both are making some valid points here. This is entirely useful approach to academic argument when emotions are involved, and emotions are super high. And so You will often see this, for example, in divorce settlements or custody disputes. It's not just that you are completely right and you are completely wrong, but you're both right and you're both a little bit wrong probably. And so we are going to reduce these tensions by acknowledging that. So in other words, we both end up winning. The Rogerian approach to academic argument has 4 components. Let's take a look at those. Okay, the first part is introducing the problem. Here's what's going on. Here's how many kids are drinking underage. Here's how many traffic accidents, how many fatalities, how much we are losing in property damage, and so forth. But notice what happens here. Notice that you immediately get into the opponent's viewpoint. So right in the very first step of this consensual argument, you're automatically going and saying, I want to be sure that I completely understand what it is that you are saying on your side of this controversy, and I need you to be sure that I fully understand your side of the argument. Can you see how that would reduce tensions right away in an emotion-filled controversy? So, step 2 now is you're going to show where and when you think that the opponent's argument is valid. So you start out by saying, here's the problem, here's the background, here's the big picture. Now, your take on this controversy is blah, blah, blah. And I actually think that you make some good points when you say this and you say that. You're not saying your entire argument is right, because then the controversy goes away and you don't have academic argument. But you are finding elements of the other side's argument right away that you think are right, and you're pointing those out. Imagine again what happens to the tension in a really highly stressful controversy when your first 2 parts of the argument are saying, let me make sure I understand what you're saying, and you know what, I think you're making a great point here in the introduction, or I think when you point out this statistic or you make this part of the argument, I think that that's worth listening to. Immediately the other side lowers their defenses and things are going to go much better. Step 3 of Rogerian is now introducing your side of the argument. Remember, there's only 4 steps, and you aren't getting into the details of your side of the argument until you are in step 3. That's really different from the Toulmin approach. So step 3 is where you are explaining now your argument, you are giving your evidence, you are trying to say, here's why I want you to accept what I want you to do. Now there are 2 steps in step 4. There's 2 parts. 4A is talking about how the opponent's argument would be better if he accepted the writer's argument. Notice that 4A does not say how stupid, how ridiculous, how weak the opponent's argument is. Instead, they're saying you have a good basis. You make a pretty valid point here, but I think it would be so much stronger if you would accept what I'm trying to say. And then part 4B, the writer tries to show how both sides, I don't know why my picture is blocking those words, but how both sides could actually work together. Remember, the purpose of Rogerian is both sides are working to create common ground. Both sides are working, they're each offering evidence, they're each offering a solution, and then both sides are saying, you know what, I don't really totally have to have my solution 100% of the way. We'll borrow some of mine, we will take some of yours, and we'll create an entirely new solution.